Hey guys, tonight we begin with the history of one of baseball's hidden workhorses. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is a figure in baseball, small and often unnoticed, who exists in the spaces between moments. He moves through the geometry of dirt and grass like a shadow cast by giants, collecting their discarded tools, their sweat-stained helmets, their broken dreams made tangible in splintered wood. The Batboy, the keeper of equipment, and, perhaps without knowing it, the keeper of something far more precious. The small rituals that bind one generation of players to the next. Close your eyes and imagine him for a moment. Not as he appears in highlight reels or newspaper photographs, but as he truly is. A bridge between the sacred and the mundane, between the roar of the crowd and the quiet whisper of leather meeting leather in an empty clubhouse after midnight. His hands, always moving, always reaching, have touched every bat that has ever sent a ball soaring into the summer sky. His feet have traced paths worn smooth by a century of other feet, other dreams, other quiet moments when the stadium holds its breath and waits. This is his story. Not the story of any one boy, but the story of all of them, woven together like the red stitches on a baseball, each thread essential, each thread part of something larger than itself. In the beginning, there was only the game itself, raw and unrefined, played on vacant lots where the grass grew wild, and the bases were whatever could be found, a rock, a piece of wood, someone's discarded shirt. This was baseball in the 1860s, when the Cincinnati Red Stockings were just beginning to imagine what it might mean to be professional ball players, and the very concept of someone whose job it was to tend to the equipment seemed as foreign as the idea that people might one day pay money to watch other people play a game. But even then, in those earliest days, there was always someone small and eager, hovering at the edges of the diamond. A boy, usually drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The sharp crack of ash meeting horsehide. The way grown men could become children again when they stepped between those chalked lines. The smell of dust and possibility that seemed to rise from the earth itself whenever 9 men gathered to play. The first Bat Boys weren't called Bat Boys at all. They were just boys who found themselves useful, who learned that if they arrived early enough and stayed late enough, if they could carry water without spilling it, and fetch balls from the tall grass beyond what would someday be called the outfield, the players might let them stay. Might even remember their names. Picture young Thomas McKenna. Though that wasn't his real name, history has forgotten his real name, as it has forgotten the real names of so many who served in the shadows. Thomas was 11 years old in 1871 when he first appeared at the South End grounds in Boston, thin as a fence post and twice as eager, his bare feet already tough from a summer spent running on cobblestones and packed earth. He had no uniform, no official role, no salary beyond the occasional nickel pressed into his palm by a player who appreciated the way Thomas could appear at exactly the right moment with exactly the right bat, as if he possessed some mystical knowledge of who would be called to hit next. Thomas learned to read the game not through its statistics or strategies, but through its sounds and smells, and the subtle shift of weight that preceded every swing. He learned that different woods had different voices when they connected with the ball. The sharp report of ash, the deeper thrum of hickory, the occasional splintering crack that meant another bat had given its life in service of the game. He learned that a pitcher's sweat smelled different in the third inning than it did in the ninth, that catchers developed a particular way of spitting that had nothing to do with tobacco and everything to do with the accumulation of dust and exhaustion that came from squatting behind home plate for 2 hours in the afternoon sun. Most importantly, Thomas learned that the space between innings belonged to him. Those few minutes when the players jogged off the field and the crowd settled back into their seats, when the diamond seemed to exhale and prepare itself for the next act of the ongoing drama. That was when the Batboy became essential. Not because the players couldn't retrieve their own equipment, but because someone needed to maintain the rhythm, to keep the small ceremonies that made the larger ceremony possible. Watch him work, this nameless boy who represents all the nameless boys who would follow. See how he moves through the dugout with the confidence of someone who belongs there, even though he has no right to belong there, even though he is separated from the players by more than age, by class, by education, by the vast gulf that exists between those who perform and those who serve. His hands, already calloused from a life that began with work, reach for the abandoned bats with a reverence that would have been comical if it weren't so genuine. Each piece of wood is unique to him, not just in its weight and grain, but in the invisible history it carries, the hits it has produced, the strikeouts it has witnessed, the particular way different players grip it in the final moment before they decide whether to swing or take the pitch. The dugouts of those early days were not dugouts at all, but simple benches arranged along the baselines, offering no protection from the sun or the increasingly sophisticated heckling of spectators who had paid their quarter and felt entitled to express their opinions about everything from the umpire's eyesight to the shortstop's ancestry. Thomas learned to work around conversations that ranged from the profound to the profane, absorbing, without judgment or comment, the fears and hopes and casual cruelties that players shared with each other, but never with the paying public. He heard them talk about money, about wives and children they supported with the $15 or $20 they might earn in a good month, about jobs they worked in the off-season, bartender, factory worker, farmer, that required calluses on different parts of their hands but provided the steady income that baseball, still more hobby than profession, could not. He heard them plan practical jokes and discuss strategy and argue about politics with the passion of men who had discovered that they were living through the birth of something unprecedented, even if they couldn't yet articulate what that something was. And, through it all, Thomas collected their equipment with the devotion of an altar boy tending to sacred vessels. The bats, especially the bats, seemed to pulse with accumulated energy, as if they retained some memory of every ball they had struck. Every moment they had been the crucial link between intention and outcome. Some players were superstitious about their lumber, refusing to let anyone else handle their favorite bat, sleeping with it beside their beds like a talisman. Others treated their bats as disposable tools, discarding them after a single game if they failed to produce the desired results. Thomas learned to recognize both types, to know without being told which bats could be handled freely and which required the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for religious relics. He developed an intuitive understanding of wood grain and balance, of the subtle differences between bats that looked identical to the untrained eye but felt as different as daggers and clubs to anyone who understood their true nature. The uniforms of that era were woolen affairs that trapped heat and odor with democratic efficiency, transforming even the most fastidious player into a walking advertisement for the primitive state of personal hygiene in post-Civil War America. By the seventh inning of a hot summer game, the dugout area where Thomas worked had taken on the aromatic complexity of a tannery, with notes of sweat, tobacco juice, beer, and something indefinably organic that might have been optimism slowly curdling into desperation. Thomas learned to work in this environment without complaint, understanding instinctively that his role required not just physical service but a kind of invisible emotional labor. He became a confessor without credentials, a therapist without training, someone safe enough to ignore but trustworthy enough to overhear the kinds of conversations that revealed the gap between the heroic figures the public imagined and the uncertain, often frightened young men who actually wore the uniforms. When a player struck out with runners in scoring position, Thomas learned to recognize the particular slump of shoulders that meant the man needed a moment alone with his failure. When someone managed a clutch hit, Thomas learned to be ready with exactly the right amount of enthusiasm, enough to acknowledge the accomplishment, not so much as to seem like he was trying to insert himself into the moment. He became a master of the peripheral, essential but unnoticed, present but invisible. As the weeks turned to months and the months to seasons, Thomas began to understand that he was witnessing something extraordinary. These men, gathered from farms and factories across New England, were creating not just a game but a new form of American theater, complete with heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies, moments of transcendent beauty and crushing disappointment. And he, Thomas, was not just watching but participating, his small contributions as necessary to the overall performance as the pitcher's fastball or the first baseman's glove. The Batboy of 1871 existed in a world without statistics beyond runs scored and games won, without official records of who swung which bat or how many times equipment had to be repaired between games. But Thomas kept his own mental records, developing an encyclopedia of preferences and superstitions, of which player liked his bat handle wrapped with twine, and which preferred the smooth feel of unadorned wood, of who could be trusted to return borrowed equipment and who had a tendency to walk off with anything that wasn't nailed down. He learned that baseball bats in that era were not the precisely engineered instruments they would eventually become, but individual works of craftsmanship, each one shaped by hand from local wood by men who understood that a fraction of an ounce could mean the difference between a sharp single to left field and a lazy fly ball to the pitcher. Players often owned only one or two bats, treasuring them like musicians treasure their instruments, knowing that a broken bat might mean weeks of adjustment to a replacement with different weight and balance. The ritual of caring for these bats became Thomas's particular expertise. He learned to recognize the hairline cracks that preceded total failure, the subtle changes in sound when wood began to lose its resilience, the way different types of wood responded to changes in humidity and temperature. On rainy days, he learned to keep the bats in the driest possible location. On particularly hot days, he learned to rotate them regularly to prevent warping. He developed techniques for cleaning them that removed dirt and pine tar without damaging the wood's natural oils, methods for storing them that prevented the handles from cracking during long winters when the team disbanded and the players returned to their regular jobs. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas learned to read the emotional life of equipment. He learned that a bat that had produced a game-winning hit took on an almost mystical significance, becoming not just a tool but a totem, invested with powers that existed somewhere between superstition and faith. He learned that players would sometimes blame their bats for their failures, cursing them with language that would have shocked their mothers, then return to them the next day with the forgiveness of lovers who couldn't bear to stay angry. The job had no formal training, no written instructions, no clear path for advancement. Thomas learned by watching, by making mistakes, by developing the kind of instinctive understanding that comes only from complete immersion in a particular world. He learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to solve problems before they became crises, to maintain the delicate ecosystem of personalities and equipment and traditions that allowed the game to function smoothly. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to understand that he was not just serving the players, but serving something larger, the game itself, which seemed to exist independently of any particular group of men who happened to be playing it at any given moment. The game had requirements, rhythms, needs that transcended individual preferences. It demanded certain kinds of care, certain forms of attention, certain rituals of preparation and maintenance that connected each day's performance to all the days that had come before, and all the days that would come after. By the end of his first season, Thomas had become invisible in the way that all truly essential services become invisible, noticed only when they fail to appear. The players had learned to depend on him without thinking about their dependence, to expect that their equipment would be clean and ready and properly arranged without considering who had made it so. He had achieved the Batboy's ultimate success, complete integration into the rhythm of the game. As the 19th century drew toward its close, baseball began its slow transformation from a gentleman's pastime to America's first professional sport, and with it, the role of the bat boy evolved from informal helper to recognized position. The 1890s brought larger crowds, more organized leagues, and the first stirrings of what would eventually become the business of baseball. With organization came standardization, and with standardization came the recognition that even the smallest roles in the grand production required definition, structure, and, most importantly, someone willing to accept responsibility for their execution. Enter William Stubb McCarthy, a boy of 14 who first appeared at the Polo Grounds in Manhattan in the spring of 1895, carrying with him not just enthusiasm, but something approaching professional pride. Unlike Thomas and the informal helpers who had preceded him, Stubb understood instinctively that he was joining not just a team, but an institution, one that was beginning to take itself seriously enough to care about details that had previously been left to chance. The Polo Grounds of 1895 was a different creature entirely from the makeshift diamonds where baseball had begun. Here were wooden grandstands that could seat nearly 20,000 spectators, a clubhouse with actual lockers, and, most relevantly to Stubbs' daily existence, a dugout that had been designed rather than simply designated. For the first time, the Bat Boy had a defined workspace, an area that belonged specifically to him and the equipment he tended. Stubbs' first morning began before dawn, when the stadium belonged only to groundskeepers and the occasional stray cat that had wandered in from the surrounding neighborhood. He learned to appreciate these quiet hours, when the grandstands stood empty and expectant, when the infield dirt lay smooth and unmarked by cleats, when the entire edifice seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the day's coming drama. The bats of 1895 had evolved considerably from their primitive ancestors. Players now had access to lumber that had been specifically selected for its grain and density, wood that had been aged and treated according to increasingly sophisticated techniques developed by craftsmen who understood that their products were no longer simple tools, but precision instruments upon which careers and reputations depended. Ash had emerged as the preferred wood, prized for its combination of strength and flexibility, its ability to drive a baseball with authority while absorbing the shock that might otherwise travel up a player's arms and into his shoulders. Stubb learned to categorize bats not just by owner but by purpose. There were practice bats, seasoned veterans that had survived countless batting sessions and bore the accumulated scars of their service, nicks and scratches and the dark stains left by pine tar and rosin. There were game bats, kept in reserve for actual competition, their surfaces maintained with the kind of obsessive care usually associated with religious artifacts. And there were emergency bats, backup equipment kept available for the inevitable moment when a favorite bat would meet its end in a shower of splinters, leaving its owner temporarily orphaned and in need of immediate replacement. The ritual of bat preparation had become elaborate by this point, a ceremony as complex and essential as any other aspect of pre-game routine. Stubb learned to prepare pine tar to exactly the right consistency, warm enough to spread smoothly but not so hot that it would bubble and create an uneven surface. He learned the precise amount of rosin that each player preferred on his bat handle, the specific techniques for applying it that would maximize grip without creating the kind of buildup that would interfere with a smooth swing. Some players had developed elaborate superstitions around their equipment that bordered on the pathological. Big Ed Delahanty, the Phillies' star outfielder, who occasionally appeared at the Polo Grounds as a visiting player, insisted that his bats be stored upright overnight, never laid flat, as if they were sacred staffs that would lose their power if allowed to rest horizontally. Mike King Kelly, whose larger-than-life personality had made him baseball's first true celebrity, required that his bat handle be wrapped with exactly 7 layers of twine, no more, no less, applied in a specific pattern that he had developed through years of obsessive experimentation. Stubb learned to accommodate these eccentricities without judgment, understanding that superstition and performance were often inseparably intertwined in the minds of men who made their living by attempting to hit a small, fast-moving object with a piece of wood. If a player believed that sleeping with his bat under his bed would improve his hitting, Stubb was prepared to ensure that the bat in question was clean enough to occupy such intimate quarters. If someone insisted that his equipment be arranged in a particular order, bats arranged by weight, heaviest to lightest, or alternating between light and heavy, Stubb developed systems for maintaining these arrangements even as equipment was used and returned throughout the course of a game. The clubhouse culture of the 1890s was considerably more refined than what Thomas had experienced 20 years earlier. But refinement was a relative concept when applied to a group of men who made their living through physical exertion in an era when bathing was a weekly rather than daily ritual. The air in the players' area remained thick with a complex bouquet of odors: tobacco, leather, wool, liniment, and the particular funk that develops when the same group of men gather in the same enclosed space day after day throughout a long summer season. Stubb learned to work in this environment with the adaptability of someone whose survival depended on his ability to remain useful without becoming intrusive. He developed an acute sensitivity to the emotional weather of the clubhouse, learning to recognize the signs of tension that preceded arguments, the particular quality of silence that followed a difficult loss, the forced cheerfulness that players sometimes adopted when they were struggling with slumps that threatened not just their statistics but their livelihoods. The bats themselves had begun to take on individual personalities in Stubbs' imagination. There was Thunderbolt, Big Ed's favorite piece of ash, which had produced 17 home runs over the course of the previous season and had been retired to ceremonial status, brought out only for the most crucial at-bats. There was Widowmaker, a particularly heavy bat favored by the team's cleanup hitter for situations where raw power mattered more than finesse. There was Needle, a light, quick bat, perfect for hit-and-run situations, and Desperado, a bat that had been designated for pinch-hitting situations when everything depended on making contact with a difficult pitch. Each bat required different care, different handling, different storage considerations. Some needed to be kept at specific temperatures to maintain their optimal flexibility. Others required regular treatment with linseed oil to prevent drying and cracking. Still, others had been modified by their owners, handles shaved down for better grip, barrels slightly flattened to increase the hitting surface, weights adjusted through the careful insertion or removal of small amounts of lead shot. Stubb learned to perform these modifications under the careful supervision of players who understood that even tiny changes could have dramatic effects on performance. He learned to use sandpaper so fine that it barely seemed to remove material at all, making adjustments measured in fractions of ounces that could mean the difference between a bat that felt perfectly balanced and one that felt sluggish and unresponsive. He learned to apply finish so thin that it was barely visible, but so crucial that its absence would leave the wood vulnerable to moisture, dirt, and the gradual degradation that came from repeated contact with baseballs. The job had expanded beyond simple equipment management to something approaching technical specialization. Stubb was expected to understand not just what each player wanted, but why he wanted it, not just how to maintain equipment, but how to optimize it for specific situations and individual preferences. He became a craftsman in his own right, developing skills that had no formal name but were essential to the smooth functioning of the increasingly complex enterprise that professional baseball was becoming. The games themselves had grown more sophisticated as well, with strategies and situational hitting that required different types of equipment for different circumstances. A player might need a heavy bat for a situation where he was trying to drive in a run with a long fly ball, then switch to a lighter bat for a situation where he needed to make contact and advance a runner. Stubb learned to anticipate these changes, to have the right equipment ready at the right moment, to understand not just the mechanical requirements of different game situations, but the psychological needs of players who were operating under increasing pressure as the stakes of professional baseball continued to rise. The crowds of the 1890s were larger and more demanding than their predecessors, creating an atmosphere of expectation that affected everyone associated with the team. Players felt increased pressure to perform, and that pressure filtered down to everyone who served them. Stubb learned that his mistakes, a bat that wasn't clean, equipment that wasn't where it was supposed to be, a moment's confusion about which player needed what, could have consequences that rippled outward, affecting not just individual performance but team chemistry, and, ultimately, the outcome of games that thousands of people had paid to see. But with increased responsibility came increased recognition. For the first time, the Batboy was acknowledged as an official position, with duties that were understood and respected rather than simply tolerated. Stubb received a small salary, barely enough to live on but sufficient to establish his role as something more than charity case or hanger-on. He received a uniform of sorts, not the same as the players' uniforms, but clothing that identified him as part of the organization, someone who belonged on the field and in the clubhouse. Most importantly, he received something approaching professional respect from the players themselves. They learned his name, asked his opinion about equipment decisions, included him in the casual conversations that bound the team together as something more than a collection of individual performers. He became a keeper not just of bats, but of institutional memory, someone who remembered which strategies had worked in previous seasons, which equipment modifications had proven successful, which superstitions had coincided with hot streaks and which had preceded slumps. As the 1895 season progressed toward its conclusion, Stubb began to understand that he was participating in something historically significant. Baseball was transforming itself from a game into an industry, and he was witnessing that transformation from a unique vantage point. He was seeing how attention to detail, even details as seemingly minor as bat maintenance, could contribute to success on a scale that affected not just individual careers, but entire franchises. The bats in his care had become more than wood and metal. They had become repositories of hope, instruments through which grown men attempted to achieve a kind of perfection that existed nowhere else in their lives. A perfectly timed swing that sent a baseball soaring over an outfield fence represented, for that brief moment, the complete alignment of human intention with physical reality. And Stubb had learned that his role in maintaining the tools that made such moments possible gave him a small but genuine share in their creation. By winter, when the season had ended and the players had dispersed to their off-season occupations, Stubb remained behind to care for the equipment that would be waiting for their return. He spent long afternoons in the empty clubhouse, cleaning and organizing and preparing, understanding that continuity was his special responsibility. The players would return different, older, perhaps wiser, certainly changed by whatever experiences had filled their winter months. But the bats would be exactly as they had left them, maintained in perfect condition, ready to resume their partnership in the ancient dance between pitcher and hitter that lay at the heart of the game. The year 1923 brought Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, and with it a boy named Anthony Hooks Campanella, no relation to the future Dodgers catcher, just another Italian kid from the Bronx whose father had died in a construction accident, and whose mother worked 16-hour days in a garment factory to keep food on the table. Hooks got his nickname from his ability to reach impossibly high shelves in the equipment room, stretching his thin arms up into spaces where bats and balls and gloves had accumulated like forgotten prayers. The stadium was a cathedral of baseball, and Hooks understood from his first morning that he had been granted access to something approaching the sacred. The clubhouse gleamed with fresh paint and electric lights. The dugout steps had been carved from granite, quarried specifically for this purpose, and the bats, dear God, the bats, represented craftsmanship that bordered on artistry. This was the era of Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and hitters who had transformed the game from a contest of strategy and speed into a display of raw power that sent balls sailing distances previously considered impossible. The bats they used were correspondingly massive. Louisville sluggers that weighed 36, 38, even 40 ounces. Pieces of ash so dense they seemed to bend the very air around them when swung with authority. Hooks learned to handle these instruments with a reverence that his predecessors would have recognized, but an attention to detail they could never have imagined. The babe's bats alone required a level of care that approached the obsessive. Ruth insisted that each of his game bats be stored at exactly 72 degrees Fahrenheit, claiming he could feel the difference of even 2 or 3 degrees when he stepped into the batter's box. He required that the handles be treated with a mixture of pine tar and rosin applied in 17 precise strokes, never 16, never 18, using a brush made from the tail hair of horses that had been raised specifically for that purpose. The ritual of preparing Ruth's equipment had become a ceremony that drew observers from throughout the organization. Front office executives would find excuses to visit the clubhouse during the hour before game time, just to watch Hooks work through the elaborate process of readying the Sultan of Swat's arsenal. Each bat had been named by Ruth himself: Black Betty, the Destroyer, Mercy, and each had its own particular requirements for preparation and storage. Black Betty was Ruth's favorite for clutch situations, a 38-ounce monster with a slight crack near the trademark that Ruth claimed gave it better whip when he connected with a fastball. The crack had to be treated daily with a mixture of linseed oil and pine pitch, applied so carefully that it sealed the fissure without altering the bat's balance. Hooks learned to perform this treatment with the precision of a surgeon, understanding that too much oil would make the bat heavy and sluggish, while too little would allow the crack to spread until the bat became unusable. The Destroyer was reserved for home run attempts, its massive barrel loaded with enough weight to send even weakly hit balls over the outfield fence. But its very power made it dangerous. Ruth had already broken 3 fingers when the bat's weight had caused his hands to slip during a checked swing. Hooks learned to prepare its handle with extra care, creating a grip surface that would prevent slippage even when Ruth's hands were sweaty from excitement or pressure. Mercy was the bat Ruth used when he wanted to make contact rather than swing for the fences, its lighter weight and quicker swing making it perfect for hit-and-run situations or at-bats where a simple single would suffice. But Ruth's definition of making contact still involved swings that would have been considered violent by most hitters, and Mercy required constant attention to prevent the kind of microscopic damage that could accumulate over a season and eventually cause catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. Lou Gehrig's bats presented different challenges. Where Ruth was superstitious and demanding, Gehrig was methodical and precise. He owned exactly 12 bats at any given time, arranged in his locker according to a system that took into account weight, condition, and intended use. Hooks learned that Gehrig's bats were tools rather than totems, maintained according to scientific principles rather than mystical beliefs. Gehrig had developed theories about wood density and grain direction that he had learned from hours of conversation with the craftsmen at Louisville Slugger. He understood that ash cut from trees grown on north-facing slopes had different characteristics than wood harvested from trees that had received more direct sunlight. He knew that wood from trees that had grown slowly during dry seasons was denser and more durable than wood from trees that had grown quickly during periods of abundant rainfall. These theories translated into specific requirements for bat care that Hooks had to master. Gehrig's bats were rotated through use according to humidity levels. Denser wood for dry days, more flexible wood for humid conditions. They were stored vertically, but not randomly. Each bat had a designated position based on its weight and the date of its last use. Gehrig insisted that no bat be used in consecutive games, claiming that wood needed time to recover from the stress of repeated impact. The preparation ritual for Gehrig's equipment was less theatrical than Ruth's, but equally demanding. Each bat had to be cleaned with a specific type of cloth that removed dirt and oil without scratching the surface. The handles were treated with rosin applied in a crosshatch pattern that provided maximum grip without creating the kind of buildup that would interfere with Gehrig's precise hand placement. Each bat was weighed daily, and any that had gained or lost more than a quarter ounce were set aside for detailed inspection. But the true complexity of Hooks's job extended beyond the superstars to the entire roster of players, each of whom had developed his own relationship with his equipment. Tony Lazzari, the Yankees' temperamental second baseman, went through bats the way other players went through chewing gum, discarding any piece of wood that failed to produce a hit in its first 3 at-bats. Hooks learned to maintain a supply of backup bats for Lazzari that were identical in weight and balance to his preferred models, understanding that the player's volatile temperament made equipment failures particularly dangerous to team chemistry. Bob Moussel, the left fielder with the strongest arm in baseball, used bats that were custom-modified for his unusual stance and swing. Hooks learned to shave the handles of Moussel's bats to exactly the right thickness, removing material in layers so thin that the process took hours, but created a grip that was precisely suited to Moussel's large hands and aggressive swing style. Too much material removed, and the bat would become fragile. Too little, and Moisel would complain that his hands couldn't feel the bat during his swing. The clubhouse of 1923 was a different world from what earlier generations had experienced. Electric lights allowed work to continue long after sunset. Ventilation systems helped to control the accumulation of odors that had previously made the player's area nearly uninhabitable. And hot water was available on demand rather than having to be hauled from external sources. But with these improvements came increased expectations and more demanding standards of service. Hooks worked in an environment where every detail was scrutinized, where the difference between good and great was measured in fractions of inches and ounces. The Yankees were becoming baseball's first dynasty, and everyone associated with the organization understood that their success created pressures that extended far beyond individual performance. Hooks's work was evaluated not just on whether the equipment was functional, but on whether it contributed to the kind of excellence that the organization had come to expect from itself. The bats themselves had evolved into precision instruments that bore little resemblance to their primitive ancestors. Louisville Slugger had developed manufacturing techniques that allowed for quality control measures previously unimaginable. Each bat was weighed to the tenth of an ounce, measured to ensure that its dimensions fell within tolerances measured in 64ths of an inch, and tested for structural integrity using methods that revealed flaws invisible to the naked eye. But even these advanced manufacturing standards couldn't account for the individual modifications that players demanded. Hooks learned to use tools that would have been familiar to furniture makers and violin crafters: fine sandpaper, precision files, calipers for measuring thickness, and balances sensitive enough to detect changes measured in grams rather than ounces. He developed techniques for altering bat weight by boring tiny holes in the barrel and filling them with materials of different densities, creating instruments that were perfectly suited to individual preferences and hitting styles. The psychological aspects of equipment management had become as important as the physical aspects. Hooks learned to recognize the signs of a player who was losing confidence in his equipment, the subtle hesitation before selecting a bat, the extra time spent examining the wood grain, the tendency to blame failures on equipment rather than technique. He learned to manage these crises with a combination of practical solutions and psychological support, sometimes switching identical bats to give a struggling player the sense that he was starting fresh, sometimes providing detailed technical explanations that restored a player's faith in his equipment. The rituals of equipment preparation had become increasingly elaborate as the stakes of professional baseball continued to rise. Hooks would arrive at the stadium 4 hours before game time to begin the process of preparing for that day's competition. Each bat had to be inspected for damage, cleaned of residue from previous games, and treated with whatever combination of oils, waxes, and grip enhancers its owner preferred. Helmets, though not yet mandatory, were cleaned and polished. Gloves were conditioned to maintain their flexibility while ensuring that they would provide maximum protection. But the bats remained the center of Hooks's universe, the pieces of equipment that seemed to carry the most psychological weight and require the most technical expertise. He learned to read wood like a fortune teller reads palms, seeing in the grain patterns and color variations the history of the tree from which each bat had been carved. He could predict which bats were likely to break during a particular game based on subtle changes in the sound they made when tapped with his knuckle. He could tell from the way a player held his bat whether the weight distribution was properly suited to that player's swing mechanics. The 1923 Yankees won their first World Series, and Hooks understood that his contribution to that victory was real if unrecorded. Every bat that had produced a crucial hit had passed through his hands, had been prepared according to specifications he had learned through months of careful observation and patient experimentation. He had become not just a caretaker of equipment, but a collaborator in the complex process through which athletic ability was translated into championship performance. As autumn gave way to winter and the clubhouse fell silent for another year, Hooks remained behind to prepare for the following season. The bats would spend the cold months in carefully controlled storage, protected from humidity changes and temperature fluctuations that could alter their characteristics before spring training began. But more than physical preparation was required. Hooks spent the winter months studying, learning new techniques from other Batboys throughout the league, corresponding with craftsmen at Louisville Slugger to understand advances in manufacturing that might affect how he cared for the following year's equipment. He had become a specialist in a field that didn't quite have a name, someone whose expertise was essential but difficult to categorize according to conventional professional standards. He understood wood and metal and leather in ways that would have been valuable in any number of trades, but his knowledge was specifically tailored to the unique requirements of baseball equipment. He had learned to see the game not as a series of discrete events, but as a continuous process in which preparation and performance were inseparably linked. The house that Ruth built had become his house too, in a sense, not because he owned any part of it, but because he had learned to serve it with a devotion that transformed service into a form of ownership. The stadium would outlast all the players who currently filled its clubhouse, and Hooks understood that his role was to maintain the continuity that connected one generation of Yankees to the next, ensuring that the standards of excellence that had produced the 1923 championship would endure long enough to produce others. The Bat Boy of 1943 lived in a different world, one where baseball itself seemed like a luxury that America could barely afford. Tommy O'Malley, 16 years old and exempt from military service due to the polio that had left his left leg slightly shorter than his right, arrived at Fenway Park each morning, knowing that half the players he served might be gone by month's end. Called away to serve in a war that made arguments about batting averages seem absurdly trivial. The equipment Tommy tended bore the scars of a nation at war. Rubber was rationed, which meant that baseballs had to be manufactured with inferior materials that made them softer and less lively than their pre-war predecessors. Metal was needed for munitions, which meant that the small metal components in bats, the ferrules, end caps, and reinforcing elements that had become standard in professional equipment were increasingly difficult to obtain and maintain. But it was the wood shortage that affected Tommy's work most profoundly. The ash forests that had supplied Louisville Slugger for decades were now being harvested to manufacture rifle stocks and aircraft components. The bats that arrived at Fenway came with apologies from their manufacturers, letters explaining that the wood was not quite as good as what they had provided in previous years, that players might need to adjust their expectations, that everyone was making sacrifices for the war effort. Tommy learned to work with equipment that would have been considered substandard just 2 years earlier. Bats arrived with visible flaws in their grain, small knots and irregularities that would previously have relegated them to batting practice use only. But these were the bats available, and Tommy developed techniques for maximizing their performance despite their inherent limitations. He learned to identify the stress points where inferior wood was most likely to fail, marking these areas with tiny dots of paint that warned players to avoid making contact at those precise locations. He developed methods for reinforcing problem areas with pine tar applied so thickly that it created a kind of protective coating, understanding that aesthetic considerations had become secondary to functionality. The players themselves were different. Older men who had been coaxed out of retirement, younger men who were waiting for their draft numbers to be called, and a small core of professional ball players who had been classified as 4F due to physical ailments that would have ended their careers under normal circumstances, but now made them essential to maintaining the illusion that life in America continued as usual. Ted Williams had enlisted in the Navy after the 1942 season, leaving behind a locker full of bats that Tommy was instructed to maintain as if their owner might return at any moment. Williams's bats were works of art. 34-ounce pieces of ash that had been selected, modified, and maintained according to standards that approached the obsessive. Each bat had been precisely weighted and balanced, with modifications so subtle that they were invisible to casual inspection but crucial to Williams's ability to achieve the kind of batting average that had made him the game's most feared hitter. Tommy spent hours each week maintaining Williams's abandoned equipment, understanding that this was both a practical responsibility and a form of ritual observance. The bats had to be kept at exact temperature and humidity levels to prevent warping. They had to be rotated regularly to ensure even aging. Most importantly, they had to be treated with the kind of reverence due to artifacts from a golden age that might never return. The absence of stars like Williams had created opportunities for players who would never have reached the major leagues under normal circumstances. Johnny "Gimpy" Morrison, a 38-year-old infielder whose arthritic knees had relegated him to semi-professional leagues before the war, now found himself starting at second base for the Red Sox. Morrison's bats were relics from an earlier era, heavy pieces of hickory that he had been using since the 1920s, maintained through repeated repairs that had left them looking like patchwork quilts of wood glue and binding tape. Tommy learned to work with equipment that required constant maintenance simply to remain functional. Morrison's favorite bat had been broken and repaired so many times that its original weight and balance had been completely altered. But Morrison refused to abandon it, claiming that it contained 17 years of good luck and could not be replaced by any piece of wood manufactured during wartime. The ritual of maintaining Morrison's bat had become an elaborate process that took Tommy nearly an hour before each game. The repairs had to be inspected and resealed. The binding tape had to be rewrapped to ensure proper grip, and the entire bat had to be treated with linseed oil applied so carefully that it strengthened the wood without adding weight. Tommy developed specialized techniques for working with damaged equipment, understanding that replacement was often impossible, and repair was therefore essential. The clubhouse atmosphere of 1943 was subdued in ways that extended beyond the usual superstitions and pre-game nervousness. Players listened to radio broadcasts of war news between innings, discussed family members who were serving overseas, and dealt with the constant awareness that their own military deferments might be revoked at any moment. The casual conversations that had once focused on batting averages and contract negotiations now revolved around rationing, casualty reports, and speculation about when the war might end. Tommy worked in this environment with the understanding that baseball was serving a purpose beyond entertainment. It was providing a sense of normalcy that helped maintain civilian morale during a period of unprecedented national crisis. The bats he maintained were not just sporting equipment but symbols of continuity, evidence that American life persisted despite the chaos unfolding on distant battlefields. The shortage of quality materials had forced innovations that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. Players began experimenting with bat modifications that compensated for inferior wood quality, hollowing out sections of the barrel to redistribute weight, inserting metal rods into handles to increase durability, and applying surface treatments that were designed more for protection than performance. Tommy became expert at these improvised techniques, learning to hollow out bat barrels without compromising structural integrity, to insert reinforcements that enhanced rather than hindered performance, and to apply protective coatings that extended the useful life of equipment that might otherwise last only a few games. His toolkit expanded to include items that would have been more familiar in a carpenter's shop than a baseball clubhouse: wood chisels, metal files, and adhesives strong enough to bond materials that had never been intended to work together. The most challenging aspect of Tommy's work was managing the psychological impact of inferior equipment on players who were already struggling with the stress of wartime uncertainty. Bats that broke during crucial at-bats could shatter more than wood. They could destroy the fragile confidence that allowed aging or inexperienced players to compete at the major league level. Tommy learned to provide both practical solutions and emotional support when equipment failures occurred. He developed techniques for rapid repair that could restore a broken bat to functionality between innings, understanding that players who had lost confidence in their primary equipment might never recover their timing and rhythm. He also learned to maintain backup equipment that was so similar to each player's preferences that substitutions could be made without psychological trauma. The scarcity of quality bats created a black market of sorts within the clubhouse itself. Players who had access to pre-war equipment guarded it jealously, sometimes sleeping with their favorite bats to prevent theft. Tommy learned to navigate the complex politics of equipment distribution, understanding that maintaining team harmony sometimes required diplomatic solutions to disputes over who had the right to use which piece of equipment. Some players had developed relationships with local craftsmen who could produce custom bats using wood that had been acquired through unofficial channels. These bats often arrived at the clubhouse accompanied by stories of midnight transactions in lumber yards, of furniture makers who had agreed to transform dining room tables into baseball bats, of connections with military suppliers who had access to materials that were unavailable through normal commercial sources. Tommy learned to work with these improvised bats while maintaining the discretion that protected both the players and their suppliers from official scrutiny. He developed techniques for disguising the origins of questionable equipment, applying official-looking markings that made unauthorized bats indistinguishable from legitimate merchandise. He understood that his silence was part of the service he provided, that players needed to trust him with secrets that could have serious consequences if revealed to the wrong people. The games themselves had taken on a different character during the war years. Crowds were smaller and more subdued, composed largely of women, children, and men who were too old or infirm to serve in the military. The atmosphere in the stands was patriotic but melancholy, with frequent reminders of the larger conflict that overshadowed all domestic concerns. Between innings, Tommy would sometimes pause in his equipment duties to watch the crowd, understanding that he was witnessing baseball during a period when its survival was genuinely uncertain. There were serious discussions in Congress about suspending professional sports for the duration of the war, redirecting all resources toward military production and morale-building activities that more directly supported the war effort. The knowledge that each game might be among the last gave Tommy's work a sense of urgency that extended beyond normal professional responsibility. Every bat he maintained might be needed for a crucial hit in what could be baseball's final season. Every piece of equipment represented not just a tool for athletic performance but an artifact of American culture during its moment of greatest testing. As the 1943 season progressed toward its uncertain conclusion, Tommy began to understand that he was serving as more than an equipment manager. He was helping to preserve something essential about American identity during a period when that identity was being redefined by global conflict. The bats in his care connected the present moment to baseball's peaceful past, and to whatever future the game might have once the war ended. The ritual of equipment maintenance had become a form of cultural preservation, ensuring that the skills and traditions of professional baseball would survive even if the institutional structures that supported them did not. Tommy was learning techniques and accumulating knowledge that might need to be transmitted to a new generation of Batboys when the war ended and baseball resumed under more normal circumstances. His work had taken on the character of stewardship, protecting something valuable during a period of crisis, maintaining standards and practices that would need to be intact when the emergency passed and normal life resumed. The bats he tended were not just sporting equipment, but repositories of cultural memory, physical objects that carried forward the accumulated wisdom of generations of players and craftsmen and equipment managers who had contributed to baseball's development as America's national pastime. In 1947, when Jackie Robinson stepped onto Ebbets Field wearing the uniform of the Brooklyn Dodgers, a 15-year-old Negro boy named Isaiah Washington was working as a bat boy for the Birmingham Black Barons of the Negro American League. Isaiah's world was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine, but his daily routine that spring remained rooted in the familiar rituals of caring for equipment that had been passed down through generations of players who had been excluded from the major leagues by barriers that had nothing to do with their ability to play baseball. The bats Isaiah tended in Birmingham were different from their major league counterparts. Older, more heavily repaired, bearing the accumulated evidence of careers that had been prolonged far beyond what would have been necessary if their owners had been allowed to compete at the highest levels of professional baseball. Satchel Paige's bats, when the legendary pitcher made appearances with the Black Barons, were museum pieces that had been maintained through decades of barnstorming tours and exhibition games, their surfaces polished smooth by countless hands, and their grains darkened by applications of pine tar that stretched back to the 1920s. Isaiah learned to work with equipment that told the story of parallel baseball universe, one where talent had flourished despite systematic exclusion, where innovation had occurred in isolation from the resources and recognition available to white players. The Negro League bats were often heavier than their major league counterparts, designed for players who had learned to generate power through technique and timing, rather than relying solely on the premium materials that were available to more privileged competitors. The clubhouse where Isaiah worked was a converted storage room beneath the grandstand at Rickwood Field, a space that would have been considered primitive by major league standards, but that served as headquarters for some of the most talented baseball players in America. The air was thick with the smell of leather oil and tobacco smoke, punctuated by the sharper odors of liniment and the medicinal alcohol that players used to treat injuries they couldn't afford to have examined by doctors. Isaiah's education in bat care came from players who had developed their techniques through necessity rather than access to specialized resources. He learned to repair split handles using techniques that would have been familiar to frontier craftsmen, binding cracked wood with leather strips soaked in pine pitch, reinforcing weak barrels with wire wrapping that was virtually invisible, but strong enough to prevent catastrophic failure during crucial at-bats. The psychological relationship between Negro League players and their equipment was intense, in ways that reflected both economic constraints and the high stakes of careers that offered few alternatives. A player who lost his favorite bat might not have access to suitable replacement, particularly if the team was traveling through regions where sporting goods stores served only white customers. Isaiah learned to treat each bat as irreplaceable, maintaining equipment with the kind of attention usually reserved for family heirlooms. Josh Gibson, the legendary catcher and power hitter who made occasional appearances with various Negro League teams, carried bats that Isaiah learned to handle with the reverence due to sacred relics. Gibson's favorite bat was a 38-ounce monster that he claimed had produced more than 800 home runs during his career, though accurate records were impossible to maintain given the informal nature of many Negro League contests. The bat showed evidence of its long service, hairline cracks that had been sealed with glue and leather patches, a handle that had been rewrapped so many times that its original diameter was uncertain, and a barrel that had been sanded and refinished repeatedly to remove the accumulated damage of thousands of at-bats. But Gibson insisted that the bat retained its power, claiming that he could feel the accumulated energy of all its previous home runs whenever he gripped it in the batter's box. Isaiah learned to maintain Gibson's bat according to specifications that bordered on the ritualistic. The handle had to be rewrapped with leather strips that came from a specific supplier in Kansas City, applied in a pattern that Gibson had developed through years of experimentation. The barrel had to be treated with a mixture of linseed oil and pine tar heated to exactly the right temperature and applied with a cloth that had been blessed by Gibson's mother. The entire bat had to be stored in a custom case that protected it from humidity changes, while allowing air circulation that prevented the accumulation of moisture that could compromise the wood's integrity. The integration of Major League Baseball created opportunities for Negro League players that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. But it also threatened the existence of the parallel institutions that had sustained black baseball for decades. As the most talented Negro League players were recruited by major league organizations, the quality of play in the Negro Leagues declined. Attendance dropped, and teams struggled to maintain the financial stability that had allowed them to provide steady employment for dozens of players and support staff. Isaiah watched this transformation with the complex emotions of someone who understood that progress often required the destruction of existing structures, even when those structures had provided valuable services under difficult circumstances. The Negro League clubhouse where he worked was about to become obsolete, but it had served as a training ground for players whose talents were finally being recognized by mainstream baseball. Larry Doby, the second black player to integrate the American League, had spent time with the Newark Eagles before joining the Cleveland Indians, and Isaiah had worked with Doby's equipment during exhibition games between Negro League teams. Doby's bats were precision instruments that reflected both his natural talent and his understanding that he would need to excel immediately upon reaching the major leagues, where he would face scrutiny that white players never experienced. Isaiah learned to prepare Doby's equipment according to standards that exceeded what was typically required in the Negro Leagues, understanding that players who were transitioning to integrated baseball needed equipment that would perform flawlessly under the additional pressures they would face. Doby's bats were maintained with obsessive attention to detail, weighed daily to detect any changes that might affect their performance, treated with conditioning agents that preserved their flexibility while maintaining their structural integrity, and stored according to protocols that eliminated any possibility of damage or deterioration. The process of integration created unique challenges for equipment management that Isaiah learned to navigate through observation and experimentation. Players who were leaving the Negro Leagues for major league opportunities needed equipment that would meet the higher standards of their new organizations, but they also wanted to maintain connections to the techniques and superstitions that had contributed to their success in black baseball. Isaiah developed techniques for modifying Negro League equipment to major league specifications while preserving the characteristics that players had come to depend upon. He learned to reduce bat weights without altering balance, to improve surface finishes without changing the feel that players had grown accustomed to, and to make adjustments that enhanced performance while maintaining the psychological connections that gave players confidence in their equipment. The clubhouse conversations of 1947 were unlike anything Isaiah had previously experienced. Players discussed not just the usual topics of strategy and performance, but the broader implications of integration for their careers, their families, and their communities. The older players, who had spent their entire careers in segregated baseball, expressed both pride in the achievements of Robinson and Doby and anxiety about their own futures in a sport that was rapidly changing in ways that might not include them. Isaiah listened to these conversations while working with equipment that bore physical evidence of the discrimination that had shaped Negro League baseball. Bats that had been repaired repeatedly because replacement was unavailable or unaffordable. Gloves that had been patched and repatched because new equipment was beyond the financial reach of players and teams. Uniforms that had been mended and altered countless times because resources that were taken for granted in the major leagues were luxuries in black baseball. But he also learned to recognize the innovations that had emerged from these constraints. Negro League players had developed techniques for equipment modification and maintenance that were often superior to their Major League counterparts, partly because necessity had forced them to become more creative and resourceful. The methods Isaiah learned for extending the useful life of equipment, for making repairs that restored full functionality, and for modifying standard equipment to suit individual preferences would prove valuable regardless of which league he eventually served. The 1947 season marked the beginning of the end for the Negro Leagues as they had existed, but it also represented the beginning of a new chapter in American baseball history. Isaiah understood that he was witnessing both a conclusion and a commencement, both the dissolution of segregated baseball and the birth of the integrated sport that would emerge from that dissolution. His work with equipment took on historical significance that extended beyond its practical purposes. The bats he maintained were artifacts of a parallel baseball universe that was about to be absorbed into the mainstream of American sports. Some would survive this transition, eventually finding their way into major league clubhouses where they would serve players who had successfully navigated the challenges of integration. Others would remain behind, eventually finding their way into museums and private collections where they would serve as evidence of the talent and determination that had flourished despite systematic exclusion. As the season progressed, and more Negro League players received opportunities to try out with Major League organizations, Isaiah began to understand that his own future might lie in integrated baseball as well. The skills he had learned in Birmingham, the ability to work with players from diverse backgrounds, the techniques for maintaining equipment under challenging conditions, the understanding of how psychological factors affected athletic performance, would be valuable in any baseball environment. The Negro League clubhouse had provided him with an education that was unavailable in any school, teaching him not just technical skills but life lessons about perseverance, dignity, and excellence under pressure. The players he had served had demonstrated that talent could flourish even under the most difficult circumstances, that professional standards could be maintained even when recognition was withheld, and that love of the game could sustain careers even when the rewards of those careers were limited by forces beyond individual control. By the end of the 1947 season, Isaiah had begun to prepare for his own transition to integrated baseball. He corresponded with Batboys in major league organizations, learning about the different standards and expectations he would encounter. He practiced techniques for working with the higher quality equipment that was standard in major league clubhouses. Most importantly, he prepared himself psychologically for the challenges of serving in an environment where he would be among the first black employees behind the scenes of America's national pastime. The bats in his care during those final months with the Black Barons represented both the end of one era and the beginning of another. They carried forward the accumulated wisdom of generations of Negro League players while preparing to serve in an integrated sport that would provide opportunities their previous owners had been denied. Isaiah understood that his role was to ensure this transition occurred smoothly, that the knowledge and techniques developed in segregated baseball were not lost, but rather incorporated into the broader tradition of American baseball equipment management. By 1969, baseball had spread across the continent like spilled paint, reaching into cities that had never dreamed of hosting major league games. In San Diego, where the Padres were beginning their first season in the newly constructed Jack Murphy Stadium, a 17-year-old named Roberto Morales arrived each morning to tend equipment for players who were themselves learning what it meant to represent a franchise with no history, no traditions, and no established way of doing things. The bats Roberto handled were different from anything previous generations of bat boys had encountered. Louisville Slugger had perfected manufacturing techniques that produced instruments of unprecedented consistency and quality, but they had also begun experimenting with modifications that pushed the boundaries of what wooden bats could accomplish. Some players were using bats with cupped ends that redistributed weight toward the handle, creating quicker swing speeds without sacrificing power. Others experimented with bats that had been treated with flame-hardening techniques that supposedly increased their durability and responsiveness. But the real revolution in Roberto's world came from aluminum. The metal bats that were becoming standard in college and amateur baseball were still forbidden in professional play, but their existence had sparked conversations about the future of hitting implements that made Roberto's work feel like a bridge between baseball's past and an uncertain future where wooden bats might become historical curiosities. The Padres' clubhouse was a study in improvisation and adaptation. The team had been assembled through expansion draft, which meant that the roster consisted largely of players who had been considered expendable by existing franchises. These were journeymen and prospects, aging veterans and untested rookies, men who understood that their opportunity in San Diego might be their last chance to establish themselves as major league players. Their equipment reflected this diversity. Some players brought bats that had served them throughout minor league careers, pieces of wood that bore the scars of hundreds of games played in small cities across America. Others arrived with equipment that was nearly new, having been recently promoted from amateur ranks where wooden bats were still a novelty. Roberto learned to work with this eclectic collection of equipment, developing techniques that could maintain bats regardless of their age, condition, or origin. Willie McCovey, acquired from the Giants midway through the 1974 season, brought with him a collection of bats that represented 15 years of major league experience. These were museum quality pieces, each one selected and modified, according to specifications that McCovey had developed through years of studying his own swing mechanics and the physics of hitting. Roberto learned to handle McCovey's equipment with the reverence due to artifacts from baseball's golden age, understanding that he was working with tools that had produced some of the most memorable home runs in the sport's history. McCovey's favorite bat was a 34-ounce piece of ash that had been seasoned for 3 years before being carved to his specifications. The handle had been shaved to exactly the right thickness for McCovey's large hands, then treated with a mixture of pine tar and rosin that had been applied in layers over several seasons. The barrel had been flame-hardened, using techniques that few bat manufacturers still understood, creating a surface that was both harder and more responsive than untreated wood. Roberto learned to maintain this bat according to protocols that McCovey had developed through years of experimentation. The pine tar had to be refreshed after every third game using a specific technique that warmed the substance just enough to make it pliable without making it sticky. The barrel had to be cleaned with fine steel wool that removed accumulated dirt without scratching the hardened surface. Most importantly, the bat had to be stored at exactly the right angle to prevent warping, hanging from pegs that supported it at the balance point to eliminate any stress on the wood grain. But McCovey's bats also represented the past in a clubhouse that was primarily focused on the future. The expansion era had created opportunities for innovation that were impossible when teams were bound by decades of tradition and established ways of doing things. The Padres, having no history to preserve, were free to experiment with equipment modifications and maintenance techniques that more established organizations might have considered too radical. Roberto learned to work with players who were eager to try new approaches to equipment management. Nate Colbert, the team's power-hitting first baseman, had begun experimenting with bats that incorporated design elements borrowed from tennis rackets and golf clubs. These bats featured handles that were slightly oval in cross-section, creating a more secure grip that supposedly allowed for better control during the swing. They also incorporated weight distribution techniques that concentrated mass in specific areas of the barrel, creating larger, sweet spots that made solid contact easier to achieve. The maintenance of these experimental bats required Roberto to learn techniques that had no precedent in traditional baseball equipment management. The oval handles could not be treated with standard grip enhancers, which were designed for round surfaces. Instead, Roberto learned to apply specialized compounds that worked with the unique geometry of the modified handles. The weight distribution modifications made these bats more sensitive to humidity and temperature changes, requiring storage techniques that maintained environmental conditions within very narrow ranges. Tony Gwynn, who joined the organization in 1982, represented a different approach to equipment innovation. Gwynn's bats were designed around his philosophy that hitting was primarily about making contact rather than generating power. His bats were lighter than those used by most players, typically weighing between 30 and 32 ounces, and they featured extended barrels that created larger hitting surfaces without adding significant weight. Roberto learned to maintain Gwynn's bats according to specifications that prioritized sensitivity and responsiveness over raw power. The wood had to be seasoned to very specific moisture content that maximized flexibility while maintaining structural integrity. The surface treatment was designed to enhance the player's ability to feel the ball's contact with the bat, using grip enhancers that transmitted tactile feedback without interfering with swing mechanics. The psychological aspects of equipment management had become increasingly complex as players began to understand the role that confidence played in athletic performance. Roberto learned to work with players who had developed elaborate superstitions around their equipment. But he also learned to distinguish between superstitions that were purely psychological and requests for modifications that had genuine technical merit. Some players insisted on bats that were stored in specific orientations, always vertical, always horizontal, all abnudars, with the label facing a particular direction. Roberto learned to accommodate these requests while gently testing whether the players could actually detect the differences they claimed to feel. In some cases, he discovered that the superstitions were covering for real technical issues that could be addressed through proper equipment management. In others, he learned that the psychological benefits of accommodation were more important than the technical realities. The expansion era had also brought changes to the business of baseball that affected equipment management in ways that were not immediately obvious. Teams were now part of larger entertainment corporations that demanded standardization and efficiency in all aspects of operations. Roberto learned to work within bureaucratic structures that required documentation and justification for equipment modifications that had previously been handled through informal agreements between players and equipment managers. He learned to maintain records that track the performance of different bat modifications, documenting which changes produced measurable improvements in hitting statistics and which were purely psychological. He learned to write reports that explained technical decisions in language that could be understood by executives who had never played professional baseball but needed to approve expenditures for specialized equipment and modifications. The globalization of baseball had brought players from Latin America, Asia, and Europe, each carrying equipment preferences and maintenance traditions from their home countries. Roberto, whose own family had immigrated from Mexico, found himself serving as a cultural translator as well as an equipment manager, learning techniques from players who had been trained in different baseball traditions while teaching them to adapt to American equipment standards. Japanese players, in particular, brought approaches to equipment management that challenged traditional American methods. They typically used lighter bats with different weight distribution, and they had developed maintenance techniques that emphasized the spiritual, as well as the technical aspects of equipment care. Roberto learned to blend these approaches with established American methods, creating hybrid techniques that honored both traditions while optimizing performance for individual players. The 1980s brought the first serious discussions about fundamentally altering the materials used in professional baseball bats. Advances in metallurgy and composite materials had created alternatives to wood that offered superior performance in virtually every measurable category. Aluminum bats were lighter, stronger, and more consistent than even the finest wooden bats. Composite materials could be engineered to provide optimal weight distribution and flexibility characteristics that were impossible to achieve with natural wood. Roberto found himself at the center of debates about the future of baseball equipment that extended far beyond the technical considerations that had previously defined his work. These were philosophical discussions about the essential nature of baseball, about whether the sport's connection to its pastoral origins required the continued use of natural materials, about whether technological advancement necessarily represented improvement. He learned to work with prototype bats made from experimental materials, understanding that his feedback might influence decisions that would affect the entire sport. Some of these experimental bats performed significantly better than traditional wooden bats, producing higher batting averages and more home runs. But they also produced different sounds when they contacted the ball, different vibrations that traveled through the player's hands, different relationships between effort and result that seemed to alter the fundamental nature of hitting. As the decade progressed, Roberto began to understand that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in baseball history. The sport was poised between its traditional past and a technological future, between the artisanal craftsmanship that had characterized equipment manufacturing for a century and the precision engineering that was becoming available through advances in materials science and manufacturing technology. His work had evolved from simple maintenance to something approaching research and development. He was testing modifications and techniques that might eventually be adopted throughout professional baseball, contributing to the ongoing evolution of equipment standards that would affect generations of future players. The bats in his care were no longer just tools for playing baseball, but experimental instruments that were helping to define what the sport might become. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting. Roberto understood that decisions made in the Padres' equipment room might influence the direction of baseball's technological development, that techniques he developed might become standard throughout the sport, that his work was contributing to a tradition that stretched back to the game's origins while helping to shape its future. The late 1990s brought Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds chasing Hank Aaron's ghost, and a generation of hitters who seemed to have transcended the physical limitations that had constrained their predecessors. In Oakland, then St. Louis, then eventually everywhere that baseballs were being launched into orbit with suspicious frequency, Batboys found themselves tending equipment for players whose relationship with their bats had become as complicated as their relationship with the substances that may or may not have been coursing through their bloodstreams. Carlos Mendoza started working for the Oakland Athletics in 1998, the year McGwire hit 70 home runs, and the baseball world pretended not to notice that the man swinging the bat looked like he had been inflated with a bicycle pump. Carlos learned quickly that the bats of the steroid era were different creatures entirely, longer, lighter, and engineered with a precision that bordered on the scientific. Where previous generations of players had relied on wood selection and basic modifications, the sluggers of the late 90s used bats that incorporated advanced materials, science, and manufacturing techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was legal under Major League rules. McGwire's bats were marvels of engineering disguised as traditional lumber. Each one was selected from ash trees that had been grown under controlled conditions, harvested at optimal times, and aged according to protocols that would have been familiar to violin makers. The wood was then treated with processes that enhanced its density and responsiveness while maintaining the natural appearance that Major League regulations required. Carlos learned to maintain these bats according to specifications that required both technical precision and absolute discretion. McGwire's favorite bat underwent daily treatments with compounds that were applied so carefully that they left no visible residue, but significantly altered the wood's performance characteristics. The handle was wrapped with materials that looked like traditional pine tar, but incorporated synthetic elements that provided superior grip and shock absorption. Even the bat's weight distribution had been modified through techniques that were invisible to casual inspection but dramatically affected its performance. The psychological pressure of maintaining equipment for players who were under constant scrutiny for possible performance enhancement created a working environment unlike anything previous generations of bat boys had experienced. Carlos learned to work under the assumption that everything he did might eventually be subject to investigation. The techniques he had learned in confidence might someday be revealed in congressional hearings or grand jury proceedings. The bats themselves seemed to carry the weight of their owner's secrets. Carlos learned to recognize the difference between bats that performed within normal parameters and those that had been enhanced beyond what natural wood should be capable of achieving. Some bats produced sounds when they contacted the ball that were subtly different from traditional wooden bats, sharper cracks that suggested harder surfaces, deeper tones that implied altered density, hollow sounds that hinted at internal modifications that were not immediately visible. Barry Bonds, who joined the Giants in 1993 but whose most controversial seasons occurred later in the decade, used bats that represented the pinnacle of legal modification techniques. Bonds had worked with craftsmen who understood wood at the molecular level, selecting pieces that combined optimal grain structure with density characteristics that maximized both power and control. His bats were works of art that happened to be functional, instruments that had been refined through years of experimentation and testing that rivaled the research and development programs of major corporations. Carlos learned to handle Bonds' equipment with the understanding that he was working with tools that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in research and development costs. Each bat had been designed specifically for Bonds' swing mechanics, with weight distribution and balance points that were calculated to optimize his particular combination of strength and timing. The modifications were subtle but extensive. Handles that had been shaped to match exactly the contours of Bonds' grip, barrels that incorporated internal structures that enhanced their responsiveness without violating the regulations that governed wooden bat construction. The maintenance of these bats required Carlos to master techniques that were part traditional craftsmanship and part advanced materials science. He learned to apply surface treatments that penetrated deep into the wood grain, altering its characteristics in ways that were invisible but measurable. He learned to perform modifications that enhanced performance while maintaining the appearance of traditional wooden bats, understanding that the distinction between legal enhancement and illegal alteration often depended on documentation and interpretation rather than objective technical standards. The era brought with it a culture of secrecy that extended far beyond the players themselves to everyone who worked with their equipment. Carlos learned to maintain confidentiality about techniques and modifications that were perfectly legal but competitively sensitive, understanding that information about how particular bats were prepared could provide advantages to opposing teams and players. He developed systems for documenting his work that provided necessary records while protecting proprietary information, learning to balance transparency with discretion in ways that satisfied both regulatory requirements and competitive needs. The clubhouse conversations of the steroid era were carefully coded discussions that acknowledged realities that could not be spoken directly. Players discussed training programs and nutritional supplements with the understanding that everyone knew more than they were saying, that the dramatic improvements in performance that were obvious to casual observers were the result of factors that extended beyond traditional preparation and natural talent. Carlos learned to work in this environment without judgment or commentary, understanding that his role required professional distance from activities that were beyond his control or responsibility. He maintained equipment for players regardless of how they had achieved their current level of performance, focusing on the technical aspects of his work while avoiding involvement in the larger controversies that surrounded the sport during this period. The bats of the steroid era incorporated innovations that would have been considered revolutionary under normal circumstances, but were barely noticed amid the larger spectacle of inflated statistics and superhuman performances. Manufacturers had developed techniques for controlling wood grain orientation that optimized strength and flexibility, methods for treating lumber that enhanced its responsiveness without altering its appearance, and quality control processes that ensured consistency at levels that were previously unattainable. Carlos learned to work with bats that incorporated these innovations while understanding their limitations and potential failure points. The enhanced performance came with increased fragility in some cases, bats that could produce extraordinary results when functioning properly, but were prone to catastrophic failure when stressed beyond their design parameters. He developed techniques for identifying bats that were approaching their performance limits, understanding that a broken bat during a crucial at-bat could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate game situation. The pressure to produce results created demand for equipment modifications that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible within existing regulations. Carlos learned to perform alterations that were legal but barely so, understanding that the distinction between enhancement and cheating often depended on interpretations of rules that had been written for simpler times and less sophisticated equipment. Some modifications involved techniques that were borrowed from other industries: aerospace materials, science, automotive engineering, even musical instrument manufacturing, adapted for use in baseball equipment. Carlos learned to work with compounds and treatments that had been developed for entirely different purposes but proved effective for enhancing bat performance when applied correctly. The corked bat scandals that periodically erupted during this era created additional challenges for equipment management, that extended beyond the technical aspects of Carlos's work. He learned to document his procedures with unusual care, understanding that any bat that broke during a game might be subject to investigation that could affect not just individual players but entire organizations. He developed systems for tracking equipment modifications that provided complete records while protecting information that was competitively sensitive or personally confidential. The relationship between players and their bats during the steroid era was intensely personal, but also heavily mediated by technology and professional consultation. Players worked with specialists who analyzed their swing mechanics using high-speed photography and computer modeling, then recommended equipment modifications that were based on biomechanical analysis rather than intuition or tradition. Carlos learned to collaborate with these specialists while maintaining his traditional role as equipment manager. He learned to implement modifications that were based on scientific analysis while preserving the psychological relationships between players and their equipment that were essential to confidence and performance. This required balancing technical precision with individual preferences, understanding that even scientifically optimal equipment was useless if players didn't trust it completely. The era also brought increased scrutiny from media and regulatory authorities that affected every aspect of equipment management. Carlos learned to work under the assumption that his activities might be monitored or investigated. The techniques he had learned in confidence might eventually be subject to public examination. This created pressure to maintain standards that were not just technically adequate, but also ethically defensible, under intense scrutiny. The steroids era fundamentally changed the relationship between performance and equipment in ways that extended far beyond the specific modifications that Carlos learned to implement. Players who were achieving superhuman results created expectations for equipment performance that pushed manufacturers and equipment managers to explore possibilities that had never been seriously considered. The bats of this era incorporated innovations that would influence equipment design for decades, even after the specific circumstances that had driven their development had passed. As the era began to draw toward its controversial conclusion, Carlos found himself serving as a keeper of institutional memory about techniques and modifications that would soon become obsolete or forbidden. The knowledge he had accumulated about advanced bat preparation methods would prove valuable in unexpected ways as baseball entered a new phase of equipment regulation and performance monitoring. But it would also serve as a reminder of a period when the sport had lost its way in pursuit of spectacle and statistical achievement. The bats in his care during those final years of the steroid era were simultaneously the most advanced implements in baseball history and artifacts of a time that the sport would eventually want to forget. Carlos understood that his role was to maintain these instruments at the highest possible level, while preparing for a future when baseball would return to more traditional approaches to equipment and performance enhancement. By 2010, baseball had entered the age of information, where every swing was measured, every bat's performance quantified, and every equipment decision could be supported or contradicted by data that had never previously existed. Miguel Santos arrived at Fenway Park that spring carrying an iPad loaded with applications that could analyze wood grain density, track humidity's effect on bat performance, and correlate equipment choices with statistical outcomes in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to previous generations of bat boys. The Red Sox clubhouse of 2010 was a fusion of traditional craftsmanship and cutting-edge technology. Players still formed personal relationships with their bats, still developed superstitions and preferences that defied rational explanation. But they also had access to data that could reveal patterns and correlations that were invisible to subjective observation. Miguel learned to work in an environment where every decision could be measured and evaluated, where his effectiveness as an equipment manager was increasingly judged by metrics that tracked everything from bat durability to player satisfaction to statistical performance. David Ortiz, the designated hitter whose postseason heroics had helped the Red Sox win 2 World Series championships, used bats that represented the marriage of old-school craftsmanship and new-age analysis. Each of Ortiz's bats was selected based on data analysis that considered wood grain orientation, density measurements, moisture content, and performance history. But they were also chosen based on how they felt in his hands, how they sounded when they made contact with baseballs, and whether they matched his psychological needs during different types of game situations. Miguel learned to maintain Ortiz's equipment using techniques that combined traditional methods with technological innovations. He used digital calipers to measure bat dimensions to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, understanding that variations invisible to the naked eye could significantly affect performance. He monitored wood moisture content using electronic sensors, adjusting storage conditions to maintain optimal flexibility and durability. Most importantly, he learned to correlate these technical measurements with performance data, developing an understanding of how physical bat characteristics translated into statistical results. The analytics revolution had created demand for documentation and record-keeping that exceeded anything previous generations of Batboys had experienced. Miguel maintained databases that tracked every aspect of equipment performance, which bats produced which types of hits, how environmental conditions affected different pieces of equipment, which maintenance techniques correlated with extended bat life, and improved player satisfaction. This information was used not just for immediate equipment management decisions, but for long-term planning and evaluation that could influence organizational policies and purchasing decisions. Dustin Pedroia, the second baseman whose hitting approach emphasized contact and situational awareness, used bats that were selected and maintained according to analytical principles that considered his specific role in the team's offensive system. Pedroia's bats were lighter than those used by power hitters, but they were engineered with precision that optimized them for his particular swing mechanics and situational hitting requirements. Miguel learned to prepare Pedroia's equipment using data that analyzed his performance in different game situations, understanding that bats optimized for hitting behind the runner required different characteristics than those designed for two-strike hitting or hit-and-run situations. The modifications were subtle but measurable. Slight adjustments to weight distribution that improved bat control, surface treatments that enhanced grip under pressure situations, balance points that facilitated quick, compact swings. The technology available to Miguel included tools that would have been considered miraculous by earlier generations of equipment managers. He used ultrasonic equipment to detect internal flaws in wooden bats that were invisible to visual inspection, identifying potential failure points before they became actual problems. He employed digital scales that could detect weight changes measured in grams, allowing him to monitor how different treatments and environmental conditions affected bat characteristics over time. The moisture meters he used could provide readings accurate to fractions of a percentage point, enabling precise control of wood conditioning that optimized performance while preventing the cracking and warping that could ruin expensive equipment. Temperature monitoring systems provided continuous data about storage conditions, ensuring that bats were maintained within optimal ranges regardless of external weather conditions or seasonal changes. But perhaps the most significant technological advancement was the integration of video analysis with equipment evaluation. Miguel learned to work with hitting coaches who used high-speed cameras to analyze swing mechanics, then correlate that visual information with data about bat performance characteristics. This allowed for equipment modifications that were based on objective analysis of how different bats affected swing plane, bat speed, and contact quality. The process of matching players with optimal equipment had become increasingly sophisticated, involving collaboration between equipment managers, hitting coaches, biomechanical analysts, and even sports psychologists who understood how confidence and comfort affected performance. Miguel learned to participate in these collaborative processes while maintaining his traditional role as the person responsible for day-to-day equipment preparation and maintenance. The manufacturing of bats had evolved to incorporate quality control measures that ensured unprecedented consistency and performance. Miguel worked with equipment that had been produced using computer-controlled machinery that could maintain tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, wood that had been selected using techniques that analyzed grain structure at microscopic levels, and finishing processes that were based on chemical analysis of optimal surface characteristics. But this technological precision created new challenges for equipment management. Bats that were manufactured to such exacting standards required maintenance techniques that preserved their engineered characteristics while adapting to individual player preferences. Miguel learned to make modifications that enhanced performance without compromising the precision engineering that had gone into the bat's original manufacture. The psychological aspects of equipment management had become more complex as players gained access to data that revealed previously hidden patterns in their performance. Some players became obsessed with metrics that correlated equipment choices with statistical outcomes, demanding modifications based on analytical evidence rather than subjective preference. Others rejected data-driven approaches entirely, insisting that feel and intuition were more important than statistical analysis. Miguel learned to work with both types of players, understanding that optimal equipment management required balancing objective analysis with subjective preferences. He developed techniques for presenting analytical information in ways that enhanced player confidence, rather than creating anxiety. Learning to use analytical insights to reinforce rather than undermine the psychological connections that were essential to peak performance. The Red Sox organization had begun using predictive modeling to forecast equipment needs, analyzing historical data to determine optimal inventory levels, replacement schedules, and modification procedures that minimized downtime and maximized player satisfaction. Miguel learned to work within these systems while maintaining the flexibility to respond to individual needs and unexpected situations that couldn't be anticipated by algorithmic analysis. The integration of biometric monitoring with equipment evaluation opened new possibilities for optimizing the relationship between players and their bats. Heart rate monitors, muscle tension sensors, and other physiological measurement devices could reveal how different equipment choices affected player stress levels and performance readiness. Miguel learned to interpret this data in the context of equipment management, understanding how physical comfort with equipment translated into measurable physiological responses. Advanced materials science had created possibilities for bat modification that pushed the boundaries of existing regulations while remaining technically legal. Miguel learned to work with treatments and enhancements that were invisible to standard inspection but significantly improved performance characteristics. These modifications required precise application and careful documentation to ensure compliance with increasingly complex regulatory requirements. The globalization of baseball had brought techniques and perspectives from international leagues that challenged traditional American approaches to equipment management. Japanese and Korean players brought maintenance philosophies that emphasized the spiritual aspects of equipment care, while Latin American players contributed techniques developed under resource constraints that maximized performance from less than optimal equipment. Miguel learned to synthesize these diverse approaches into comprehensive systems that honored different cultural perspectives while meeting the technical requirements of Major League Baseball. He developed protocols that incorporated meditation and mindfulness practices alongside scientific analysis, understanding that peak performance required attention to psychological and spiritual factors, as well as technical optimization. The spring of 2020 brought silence to baseball stadiums across America, an unprecedented interruption that forced everyone connected to the sport to confront questions about what was essential and what was merely habitual in their daily routines. In Seattle, where the Mariners' season would be delayed and then played in empty stadiums, a Batboy named Elena Rodriguez found herself maintaining equipment for a sport that suddenly seemed disconnected from the world that had created it. Elena's work during the pandemic required her to reimagine every aspect of equipment management according to health protocols that prioritized safety over tradition. The bats she maintained had to be disinfected after every use, stored according to procedures that prevented viral transmission, and handled with protective equipment that created barriers between her and the tools she was responsible for caring for. The intimate relationship between equipment manager and equipment that had defined the role for more than a century was suddenly mediated by masks, gloves, and sanitization procedures that transformed familiar routines into clinical protocols. The empty stadiums created an acoustic environment that revealed aspects of the game that had been masked by crowd noise for generations. Elena learned to work in silence that amplified every sound. The crack of bat meeting ball, the whispered conversations between players, the subtle creaks and groans of wooden bats adjusting to temperature and humidity changes. This audio clarity provided new insights into equipment performance that had been unavailable when stadiums were filled with thousands of cheering fans. Kyle Lewis, the American League Rookie of the Year who was navigating his early career during this surreal period, used bats that had been selected and prepared according to analytics that took into account the unique acoustic environment of empty stadiums. The absence of crowd noise meant that players could hear their equipment's performance characteristics with unprecedented clarity, detecting subtle variations in bat response that had previously been inaudible. Elena learned to prepare Lewis's equipment with attention to details that had never been considered significant. The sound of bat meeting ball became a diagnostic tool that revealed information about wood density, moisture content, and structural integrity that had been masked by ambient noise in normal game conditions. She developed techniques for tuning bats to produce optimal acoustic responses, understanding that players were unconsciously using audio feedback to adjust their swing mechanics and timing. The pandemic protocols created new categories of equipment failure that had nothing to do with structural integrity or performance characteristics. Bats that couldn't be properly disinfected had to be removed from service regardless of their condition. Equipment that showed signs of contamination required quarantine procedures that could remove valuable tools from availability for extended periods. Elena learned to maintain larger inventories than had been traditionally necessary, understanding that pandemic-related equipment losses had to be anticipated and planned for in ways that normal wear and tear did not require. She developed rotation systems that ensured adequate supplies while meeting health department requirements for sanitation and isolation that had never been applied to sporting equipment. The psychological impact of playing in empty stadiums affected players' relationships with their equipment in ways that Elena learned to recognize and address. The absence of crowd energy created a more introspective game environment that intensified players' focus on their tools and preparation rituals. Some players became more dependent on equipment superstitions as they searched for sources of psychological comfort in the eerily quiet stadiums. Jared Kelenic, who made his debut during this period, developed relationships with his bats that were shaped by the unique circumstances of pandemic baseball. Without crowd noise to mask the subtle sounds of his swing mechanics, Kelenic could hear details of his equipment's performance that provided immediate feedback about technique and timing. Elena learned to prepare his equipment to optimize these audio cues, understanding that sound had become a crucial component of performance evaluation. The pandemic also accelerated the adoption of technologies that had been developing gradually but were suddenly essential for maintaining operations under social distancing requirements. Elena learned to use remote monitoring systems that allowed equipment evaluation without direct physical contact. Sensors that could detect bat condition and performance characteristics without requiring hands-on inspection. Virtual reality systems were introduced for equipment training and evaluation, allowing players to test bat modifications and adjustments in simulated environments before committing to changes in their actual game equipment. Elena learned to coordinate between virtual testing and physical implementation, understanding how digital simulation data translated into real-world equipment modifications. The isolation requirements created opportunities for equipment innovation that had been impossible under normal playing conditions. With reduced game schedules and restricted travel, Elena had more time to experiment with modifications and treatments that required extended preparation periods. She developed techniques for wood conditioning and bat customization that were more elaborate and precise than anything that had been feasible during normal seasons. The pandemic years also brought increased focus on equipment sustainability that reflected broader cultural concerns about environmental impact and resource conservation. Elena learned to implement recycling and reuse programs that extended the useful life of equipment while reducing the organization's environmental footprint. Broken bats were reclaimed for alternative uses, damaged equipment was repaired rather than discarded, and purchasing decisions were made with consideration for long-term environmental impact. The empty stadiums provided unique opportunities for equipment testing and evaluation that were impossible under normal conditions. Without crowd noise and distractions, Elena could conduct detailed acoustic analysis of bat performance, measuring sound characteristics that correlated with hitting effectiveness. She developed databases of audio signatures that could predict bat performance and identify optimal equipment for specific players and situations. The social isolation experienced by players during the pandemic created stronger bonds between individuals and their equipment. Elena observed that players developed more intense psychological relationships with their bats when other sources of comfort and familiarity were restricted. Equipment became not just tools for performance, but sources of emotional stability and connection to normal routines that had been disrupted by extraordinary circumstances. The reduced travel schedules allowed for equipment maintenance and modification procedures that had been impossible when teams were constantly moving between cities. Elena learned to implement comprehensive bat conditioning programs that required weeks or months to complete, understanding that the pandemic's silver lining was the opportunity to optimize equipment preparation in ways that normal scheduling constraints had prevented. As the pandemic years drew toward their conclusion and stadiums began to welcome back fans, Elena found herself managing a transition back to normal operations that required readjusting to crowd noise, traditional scheduling pressures, and equipment protocols that prioritized performance over health safety measures. The knowledge and techniques she had developed during the isolation period proved valuable for improving equipment management under normal conditions, but they also served as reminders of a period when baseball had been forced to confront its essential nature and distinguish between what was truly necessary and what was merely traditional. By 2023, the Batboy had evolved into something approaching a data scientist, though one who still worked primarily with wood and leather and the ancient rhythms of a game that resisted fundamental change. Marcus Thompson, working for the Houston Astros in their gleaming new training facility, spent his mornings analyzing bat performance metrics on tablets that could process more information than entire organizations had possessed just a decade earlier. Then spent his afternoons applying that knowledge to equipment maintenance routines that would have been recognizable to bat boys from the 1920s. The convergence of traditional craftsmanship with cutting-edge technology had created possibilities for equipment optimization that pushed the boundaries of what was achievable within existing regulations. The Astros, despite their reputation for analytical innovation, maintained a clubhouse culture that honored both statistical analysis and intuitive understanding, requiring Marcus to navigate between evidence-based decision-making and the psychological needs of players who still formed personal relationships with their equipment. Alex Bregman's bats represented the pinnacle of this technological convergence. Each piece was selected using artificial intelligence algorithms that analyzed wood grain patterns with computer vision systems, correlating structural characteristics with performance data from thousands of similar bats. But they were also chosen based on how they felt in Bregman's hands during live batting practice, how they sounded when they made contact with different types of pitches, and whether they matched his psychological needs during high-pressure situations. Marcus learned to maintain Bregman's equipment using techniques that combined molecular-level materials science with traditional woodworking craftsmanship. He used spectroscopic analysis to determine optimal wood conditioning compounds, understanding how different chemical treatments affected performance at the cellular level. But he also relied on tactile evaluation methods passed down through generations of equipment managers, feeling for subtle changes in wood texture and flexibility that revealed information unavailable to technological analysis. The artificial intelligence systems available to Marcus could predict equipment failure with accuracy that exceeded human intuition, identifying bats that were likely to break based on microscopic stress patterns invisible to conventional inspection. But they could also analyze player psychology and performance patterns to recommend equipment modifications that addressed confidence and comfort issues that were crucial to athletic performance but difficult to quantify. Yordan Alvarez, the designated hitter whose power had made him one of baseball's most feared offensive weapons, used bats that were optimized using machine learning algorithms that had analyzed thousands of hours of swing video to identify the equipment characteristics that maximized his particular combination of strength and timing. The modifications were subtle but measurable. Weight distribution adjustments that improved his bat control, surface treatments that enhanced his grip under pressure, and balance modifications that facilitated his aggressive swing style. Marcus learned to implement these algorithmic recommendations while preserving the psychological relationships that were essential to player confidence. He developed techniques for making precise technical modifications that were invisible to casual observation, understanding that players needed to feel that their equipment was still recognizably theirs even when it had been optimized according to analytical principles. The manufacturing of modern bats incorporated quality control measures that ensured consistency at levels that would have been considered impossible by previous generations. Marcus worked with equipment that had been produced using robotic machinery guided by artificial intelligence, wood that had been selected using satellite imagery analysis of forest conditions, and finishing processes that were controlled by sensors that could detect variations measured in parts per million. But this technological precision created new challenges for equipment customization and maintenance. Bats that were manufactured to such exacting standards required modification techniques that preserved their engineered characteristics while adapting to individual player needs. Marcus learned to use precision tools guided by computer control systems, making adjustments that were measured in micrograms and implemented with the tolerances that would have been meaningless to earlier generations of equipment managers. The integration of biometric monitoring with equipment evaluation had reached levels of sophistication that provided real-time feedback about how different equipment choices affected player performance. Marcus learned to interpret data from sensors embedded in batting gloves, heart rate monitors that tracked stress responses to equipment changes, and muscle tension measurements that revealed how different bats affected swing mechanics at the physiological level. Virtual reality training systems allowed players to test equipment modifications in simulated game situations before committing to changes in their actual gear. Marcus learned to coordinate between virtual testing environments and physical equipment preparation, understanding how digital simulation data translated into real-world performance improvements. The ability to test hundreds of variations without using actual equipment accelerated the optimization process while reducing the risk of implementing changes that might negatively affect performance. The globalization of baseball had brought techniques and perspectives from international leagues that continued to challenge traditional American approaches to equipment management. Marcus learned to incorporate insights from Japanese craftsmanship traditions that emphasized the spiritual aspects of equipment preparation, Korean analytical approaches that prioritized statistical optimization, and Latin American innovation methods that maximized performance from limited resources. Sustainability concerns had become increasingly important in equipment management decisions, reflecting broader cultural awareness of environmental impact and resource conservation. Marcus learned to implement programs that extended equipment life through advanced maintenance techniques, recycling programs that reclaimed materials from damaged equipment, and purchasing policies that prioritized manufacturers who demonstrated commitment to environmental responsibility. The social media age had created new pressures and opportunities for equipment management that extended beyond the traditional focus on performance optimization. Players' equipment choices became part of their personal branding strategies, requiring Marcus to understand how different bats photographed for social media posts, how equipment modifications affected visual aesthetics, and how traditional performance considerations needed to be balanced against marketing and promotional requirements. Advanced materials science had created possibilities for bat enhancement that pushed the boundaries of existing regulations while remaining technically legal. Marcus learned to work with nanotechnology applications that improved wood performance at the molecular level. Surface treatments that were invisible to standard inspection but significantly enhanced grip and durability, and structural modifications that optimized performance characteristics without violating regulations that had been written for simpler technologies. The analytical revolution had created demand for documentation and record keeping that exceeded anything previous generations had experienced, but it had also provided tools that made comprehensive tracking and analysis feasible. Marcus maintained databases that correlated equipment choices with performance outcomes across multiple variables, understanding patterns that would have been invisible to subjective observation but were clearly revealed by statistical analysis. As summer 2025 settles over baseball stadiums from coast to coast, the game continues its eternal conversation between past and future, between the romance of tradition and the relentless logic of progress. In clubhouses across America, Bat Boys tend equipment that incorporates technologies unimaginable to their predecessors, yet they perform their duties according to rhythms and rituals that have remained essentially unchanged since the sport's earliest days. The bats themselves have become marvels of engineering, precision instruments that incorporate advances in materials science, manufacturing technology, and performance optimization that rival the most sophisticated products of any industry. They are selected using artificial intelligence, maintained using molecular analysis techniques, and customized according to datasets that would have overwhelmed entire organizations just a generation ago. Yet they remain, at their core, pieces of wood shaped by human hands and swung by human beings who understand that athletic performance depends on factors that transcend measurement and analysis. The crack of ash meeting horsehide still sends baseballs soaring over outfield fences with a sound that connects the present moment to every similar moment that has preceded it throughout the game's long history. The Bat Boy of 2025 exists at the intersection of craft and science, tradition and innovation, human intuition and artificial intelligence. He arrives at the stadium each morning carrying devices that can analyze wood grain at the molecular level. Yet he still relies on senses and skills that have been passed down through generations of men and women who understood that caring for equipment was really about caring for the dreams and aspirations of the players who used it. Watch him work in the quiet hours before game time, when the stadium holds its breath and prepares for another day's drama. See how he moves through routines that honor both the analytical requirements of modern baseball and the psychological needs of players who still form personal relationships with their tools. His hands, guided by sensors and informed by data, nonetheless work with the reverence and attention that his predecessors would recognize and respect. The bats in his care carry forward the accumulated wisdom of more than a century of innovation and refinement. Yet they serve the same fundamental purpose that they have always served: to provide players with the tools necessary to participate in the ongoing miracle of baseball, the ancient dance between pitcher and hitter that lies at the heart of America's most enduring game. The circle continues, each generation of Bat Boys learning from their predecessors while adapting to the demands of their particular era, each one contributing to a tradition that stretches backward to the sport's origins and forward toward futures that can only be imagined. The game changes, the equipment evolves, the techniques become more sophisticated, but the essential relationship between the one who serves and the game that is served remains constant. In the end, the Batboy stands as a reminder that baseball's greatest achievements emerge from the marriage of individual excellence with collective support, that the moments of transcendent beauty that define the sport are made possible by countless hours of careful preparation, performed by people whose names will never appear in record books, but whose contributions are essential to everything that follows. The wooden bat, seasoned and prepared and maintained with a devotion that borders on the sacred, remains the crucial link between intention and outcome, between the dream of perfect contact and its actual achievement. And the Bat Boy, keeper of these instruments, servant of these dreams, continues to occupy his unique position in the grand theater of baseball. Invisible but essential, humble but crucial, a guardian of the tools that transform human aspiration into sporting immortality. The game goes on. The seasons cycle from spring training through autumn's final out, and somewhere in every clubhouse, a bat boy tends equipment with the understanding that he is participating in something larger than himself, contributing to a tradition that connects him to everyone who has ever served the game in similar capacity, ensuring that the next generation will inherit tools prepared with the same care and attention that has characterized this most essential of baseball services since the very beginning.